Welcome back. In the previous chapter, we talked about how the labor supply curve represents workers' decisions to work and how much they want to work. We saw how changes in wages, non-labor income, and taxes could influence their decisions. And now we're going to move to the other side of the equation, to firms and their decisions. So we'll build the labor demand curve for the entire industry based on each individual firm and see how changes influence firms' decision-making process. So firms don't simply want to see warm bodies around the office or in the plant. They also don't hire their people for their sunny disposition or their sense of humor. The goal of hiring workers is to increase the firm's profitability. Consumers want to purchase goods and services, and firms hire people so that they can provide those goods and services to consumers, earning themselves some money in the process. The firm's labor demand is not quite the same as consumer demand. Consumer demand is determined by their own wants and needs. On the other hand, firms' demand for labor is called derived demand. That's because their labor demand is determined by how many people want to buy their product. There's nothing inherent in the firm for their decision-making to decide how many people to hire. Without people wanting to buy the firm's products, they would not hire any workers because the firm wouldn't exist because they're not selling anything. The demand for goods and services are similar to labor demand. However, there's some key differences that are worth discussing in detail. So that's how we're going to begin this lecture. To really understand what drives a firm's labor demand, we're going to dig into the firm's production function. Now, this is not the most exciting thing in the world, and there will be several graphs. I do apologize for that, but these are necessary in order to understand why firms are willing to pay certain wages, but not higher wages. So we're going to need to understand the internal workings of the firm. The firm's production function is a term that we use. Basically, it's a mathematical way to represent how firms turn inputs into goods and services. These inputs include raw materials, products that are being produced by other firms, physical capital like machines, and of course, workers, which we're concerned about in this chapter. Now, since this is a model, again, like we've been talking about since the beginning of the course, we are going to be simplifying things. Now, it may not mean things are perfectly realistic, but if we simplify the right things, we can make it so the model is easy enough to work with while still illuminating what's happening in the real world. So in this case, we're going to assume there's only two factors involved in production. In reality, there's many more. But for our analysis, we only really care about workers and then the capital they use in the production process. Firms have a number of options of capital and labor available to them. So they face a choice. Excuse me. How much of capital and how much of labor to choose that will maximize their profits. So by breaking down a firm's product into a simple equation, we can start to get at this. So let's begin with Q, or the firm's total output, as a function of employee hours and capital. Now, throughout the analysis, we will just call E employees, but the hours they work do matter. In this case, we're just assuming that each employee works the same amount of hours. Now, remember, marginal just means the next unit. So the marginal product of labor is the change in output resulting from an additional unit of labor, holding all the other inputs constant. For our model, an additional unit of labor is hiring another worker. We can say that the marginal product of labor is the resulting output from hiring one additional worker without making any changes to the amount of capital that we're using. The marginal product of capital is the change in output resulting from employing one additional unit of capital, whatever that unit is, holding constant the quantities of other inputs like workers. Your textbook has a table 3.1, which provides an example of a company with a number of employees and output, and uses that to calculate the marginal product and the average product. We can then take that table and use it to make two graphs that appear on this slide. The figure on the left shows us the output based on the number of workers. Now remember, for this graph right here, we're holding the capital constant, meaning that everything that the company does and all of the equipment that they use is not changing. The only thing changing is the number of workers. So we can trace the effect of the marginal worker, which is how much the input increases as you add an additional worker. So here on the total product curve, the difference between 2 And 3, that's going to be the marginal product. So as you add more workers, initially the output increases. We find that in the beginning it increases fast. So down here it increases fast. It's steeper in the curve, but then over time it's going to start to level off. You can really see that in the second graph when we look at the marginal product here, where the marginal product increases sharply at first, and then the rate at which it increases declines over time as you add more and more workers, but you're holding the capital constant. Remember, the marginal product is the additional output caused by adding an additional worker. So when we look at the marginal product, like I said, at first it rises sharply and it begins to fall. I want you to stop and think about this for a second. Does this seem right to you? It can be tempting to think that adding more workers will continue to increase the production at the same rate, that this total product would be a straight line going up at whatever slope, and then the marginal product would be flat going across. But let's really think about this. We're holding capital constant and really everything else besides the number of workers constant. So in this case, the phrase too many cooks in the kitchen is really coming to life. Now, when I taught at my previous institution, the St. Francis University, which is a small school in Western PA, I used the example of a pizza shop because at St. Francis, there was only one bar and one pizza shop in town. It was located in a very small town. But everyone loves pizza, so I think it's a good example for anyone. So imagine a pizza shop. At first, the owner hires a second worker to join them, and it increases output a lot. So now one can stay at the register and maybe work the room, clearing up tables, stuff like that, while the other one works in the kitchen primarily, instead of having one person run back and forth, taking the order and then going back and making it in the kitchen. Now, adding a third worker can be even better. Now they have someone that can focus on bussing the tables, bringing out food, sweeping up, and then when they're not busy, helping out in the kitchen. It's great. But if you keep hiring additional workers to the same kitchen, soon one will sweep here and there, but then they'll have nothing else to do in between. One will spend all their time at the counter, even when there's no customers waiting. There are only so many pizza ovens and so many dishwashers available for them to work, and eventually too many workers start to get in the way. And that's why we see the marginal product start to decline. Eventually, it will even become negative, as adding too many workers will result in people wasting time and distracting each other. When we say that the marginal product of labor is rising as it increases here from 1 to 3 workers. So initially 1, 2, 3 up here until it eventually peaks at about 20 units. After that point, it continues to increase. These numbers here are positive, but it does so at a decreasing rate. So then slowly you're moving down. Eventually, as you get to 8 workers, their marginal product is only 10 units instead of 20. So here we say the marginal product is falling, and we call this the law of diminishing returns. Now, we also include the average product curve here, which is a slightly different shape than the marginal product curve. We define the average product as the amount of output produced by the average worker. So what we do is we take the total output and we divide that by the total number of workers. So the average product is going to increase as long as the marginal product, this curve here, is greater than the average product. You see here where it crosses the line, that's the highest point of the average product. And then as the marginal product falls and continues to stay below the average product is going to decline. This should make intuitive sense. As you add a number that is larger than the average, it's going to increase the average. So looking at the average daily temperature as we move through the spring and into the summer, each day it's hotter and hotter. It's going to bring up the average. But eventually, and by the time you're watching this lecture, hopefully it's fall and the weather is starting to cool down. As the temperature starts to dip into the 70s and the 60s, that's going to slowly bring down the average temperature for the year. That's exactly what we see going on here. Now, we say that the objective of the firm is to maximize profits. In the earlier lecture about Hayek's writings, I talked about how firms create products that meet people's needs. That can be thought of the social function that firms serve in a market economy. Now, this is in general, they don't meet people's needs perfectly. Sometimes we need laws and regulations to make sure that their incentives align to meet people's needs. But in general, that's basically what firms do at the societal level. But from the firm's perspective, their goal is to maximize profits over the long run. Now, to do so, they often set shorter term goals. Sometimes it's to maximize profits in the short run. Sometimes it could be other metrics like sales, revenue, maybe specific growth in certain areas. But generally, the long-term goal is to maximize their profits. So we're going to consider the profit maximization goal to help understand the demand for labor. Now, profits are the price of the product times the quantity of the product sold, minus all of the costs. So minus the wages times the number of workers, and minus the cost of capital times the amount of capital. From the firm's perspective, the wage rate and the prices of capital are determined in markets and are outside of their control. This isn't strictly true in all cases. Sometimes there are firms that are large enough and they're like the only one in their industry that their wage decisions can affect the market for the type of employee. But for just about every other firm, they don't have the power to set wages. If they set them artificially low, no one's going to apply to the job. If they set it artificially high, everyone is going to try to get a job there. But they're not going to be profitable because they don't need to offer that high of a wage. Now we can split up time into two segments, the short run and the long run. We kind of create the definitions for short run and long run. There's no objective time frame that makes something the short run versus the long run. So we define the short run as the time period where the firm is unable to change any of its capital. So the firm is unable to buy or sell capital, so the machinery that they use, expand or buy a new plant, buy or lease a new building, et cetera, all those sorts of things. They are only able to hire and fire workers. That's the only part of this that is variable. The reason why we're considering this, and that's the only thing that can change, is because we're concerned about their employment decisions. Now, the short run could be weeks, or it could be several years. Depends on the firm and on the industry. Sometimes firms agree to long-term leases, and capital is very specialized and very expensive. So any changes are going to take a long time to materialize. Now, firms do not have access to their entire output and marginal cost curves. That's important to note. We're going to be working with these curves, but for a lot of firms, they can't actually see them in real time. For some types of jobs, you can see how much an individual contributes, but for most jobs out there, there are many people involved in the selling of one single product or one single unit of that product. So sometimes firms can see the marginal product of the newest worker, and they can have some kind of estimates of the curves around their employment, maybe a little bit below that, a little bit above that, but they can't see the entire thing. But we're going to walk through examples with full curves, partially to make it easy for us. Now, the value of the marginal product of employment is the marginal product of each worker multiplied by the value of the output, or the price that the firm is selling it at. So we can think of this as the benefit of hiring an additional worker if we maintain the same amount of capital. It's the marginal product of that worker times the price of the good. So when we graph it, the value of the marginal product employment curve is the same as the marginal product curve, just blown up or a little bit higher. So here we see the value of the marginal product and the value of the average product. And again, these are the same shape as the curve we saw a couple slides ago, because this is the same basic example, except now the price of this good is at $2. So it's kind of doubling. These curves, like I said, should look familiar. Yeah, think of it this way. Firms have a bunch of workers already. So their decision isn't to hire. Their decision isn't we have no workers. Should we hire 45 or 46? In reality, firms already have 45 workers, and they ask themselves, do we stay here at 45 or do we hire an additional worker? In order to reach this decision, one of the things they do is consider the value that that additional worker will add, and they estimate that based on the value of the marginal product of the last hired worker. Once they have an idea of this value, they compare that to the wage rate that it will take to attract a worker to fill that position. Now, if the market wage rate is higher than the value that that worker brings, the firm is not going to hire that worker. Or maybe they will have a job opening set at a lower wage that no one applies to because it's below the market wage. But if the wage is below the value of their marginal product of labor, the firm will be happy to hire them. They will be able to earn a profit off that. They'll be able to make themselves better off. The employee will bring in more value than they have to pay for. Using the graph above, we can see this visually. So if the market rate for wages is $38, right here, the firm will hire 4 workers. The 5th worker that they hire, so moving from 4 here down to 5, the value of their marginal product of labor is below $38. So the firm will be net losing money by hiring this next worker, so they won't hire them. Now let's say the market wage is down here $22. The firm will have 2 choices. They can hire 1 worker whose the value of their marginal product is equal to $22, or 8 workers. So how are they going to decide? Well, you can think starting at 1 worker, and they'll see the value of adding the 2nd worker, because the value of their marginal product is going to be above $22. It's going to be somewhere up here around, I don't know, 28 or 30. So they'll be happy to hire that worker. Moving from 1 to 2. Then they'll be happy to move from 2 to 3, as that's getting close to $38. And then the 4th, and again, that's above 22. And they'll keep going all the way down until they reach that 8th worker. The value of their marginal product is $22. Once they reach 8, they're not going to want to go on and hire that 9th worker. Hiring that 9th will not be profitable. Now, what happens here if the market wage is $50? So way up here. Well, $50 doesn't cross the value marginal product line at all. So the firm will not want to hire anyone. It simply isn't profitable. These are businesses that don't exist, or currently existing businesses that don't open up a line to offer another product. My grandpa, back when he was a young guy, used to deliver blocks of ice to homes for people's ice boxes. The value of the marginal product of labor for a guy delivering blocks of ice to people's homes today is just too low compared to the wage that you would have to pay them in order to get them to be willing to work for you. So we don't see companies in every town offering the service. Now, of course, sometimes firms are wrong. People make mistakes, whether it's in their personal life, whether it's in their shopping in the market context, or whether it's them making decisions for firms as their role as an employee. Sometimes it's too difficult to estimate how much a worker adds, and firms will make a mistake. Sometimes they try to project into the future, and they know they're going to be expanding their capital soon, so they want to bring on employees before they're profitable, knowing that they will be soon in the future, and by the time they make that capital expansion, they will have the worker trained up and ready to go. So this model isn't perfect, but provides basic understanding of how firms behave, and it does a good job of illuminating firms' decision-making process. Now we can use this little bit of work that we've done so far to derive the short-term labor demand curve. We can use this curve to tell us what will happen to the firm's employment as the wages that they offer changes, still holding capital constant like we have done this entire time. This means that if wages rise, the firm might hire fewer workers, and if wages fall, they will hire more workers. The curve reflects how labor becomes more expensive or more affordable relative to the wage rate. The labor demand curve slopes downwards because of 2 key reasons. First, hiring an additional worker increases the firm's cost. Second, as more workers are added, the marginal product of labor, or the extra output from hiring 1 more worker, tends to decrease due to the law of diminishing returns that we talked about earlier. Remember, this law says that if you keep adding workers while keeping capital constant, each new worker adds less total production than the previous one eventually. Therefore, the firm is less willing to hire additional workers at higher wage rates. Let's say a firm operates a small bakery with 1 oven, so capital is constant. They only have that 1 oven. Initially, hiring 1 worker results in a lot of baked goods being produced. But if they hire a 2nd worker, production may increase even further. But as they keep adding more and more workers without increasing the number of ovens, eventually they begin to crowd the kitchen up. By the end, each new worker adds less and less to the bakery's total output. So the firm won't want to keep hiring unless wages drop enough to make that extra worker worthwhile. So this diminishing productivity explains why the labor demand curve slopes downward. But we don't have to rely on intuition. We can see this graphically. So the firm's value, the marginal product curve, is its labor demand curve. So this makes us very straightforward that curve serves basically 2 purposes. So we have the hourly wages on the y-axis and the number of workers on the x-axis in this example. So let's look at the first value marginal product curve. Initially, the wage is here at $22. So firm is going to be willing to hire 8 workers. But what happens if the market wage falls to $18? Well, we would move along the labor demand curve, the value of marginal product curve. So we start at 22 with 8 workers, and we move down until we reach $18, and that's going to lead us to 9 workers. Now, that's because, just like before, the marginal value of the 9th worker at the beginning was $18, so that's below the wage that they would command. But once the wage falls to $18, that is the value they would provide the company. So the firm would be willing to hire that last worker. At the lower market wage, it's now profitable to hire that worker. Now, the second curve here, the value marginal product curve prime, or whatever you want to use to describe that tick. That shows what happens if the price of the good increases. So now at each level of workers, the value that they're producing for the firm is higher because the firm is able to get a higher price for the goods that they're selling. So when the price of a good increases, that's going to shift the curve out and to the right. If the price fell from this original curve here, it would shift the curve inward because the firm is now making less money for each additional worker and each unit sold. But now in this example, the price is higher. We've shifted out here to the right. The firm is now willing to hire more workers at each wage level because the return from hiring each worker is higher. This is why the demand curve shifts to the right. Each worker is now effectively more profitable. It is as if each employee is more valuable because the firm can make more money from each of them. In this case, shifting the demand curve to the right is called an increase in demand. At every wage rate, the firm is willing to hire more workers because they produce more revenue for the firm. So back at $22 an hour here, trace that out until it crosses the new labor demand curve. That is consistent with the firm hiring 12 workers. Now, my dad took an economics course back in the 1970s when he was an undergrad. He likes to say that the only thing that he remembers from class is that MC equals MR. This is partially because he slept through class, so there wasn't too much for him to remember, and partially because his professor said, if you take one thing away from this class, I want you to remember this. Now, it is important, so I want you to take this away from this class too. Marginal revenue is the additional revenue from the firm, or that the firm earns selling from one more unit of output. The marginal cost is the additional cost that the firm incurs from producing that unit of output. If the firm is maximizing profits, they will produce up to the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. If they stop producing before that, when the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, they're in effect leaving money on the table. By producing an additional unit, they can increase their profit. So if they are leaving money on the table, if they're not producing where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, they won't do that very long. They'll increase their production until marginal revenue equals the marginal cost where they maximize their profit. But they also don't want to produce more than that, where the marginal revenue is less than the marginal cost. At this point, they're just losing money on each unit. Just like a firm maximizes profits by producing up to the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, a firm also maximizes profits when they hire workers by applying a similar rule. Think of their decision to hire labor, their labor demand curve, in the same way. So firms aim to optimize their choices by comparing the marginal benefits to the marginal cost. So they want to hire workers until the value of their marginal product equals the added cost of hiring that worker. When the value of an additional worker produces, their VMPL is greater than the wages that they're paid, the firm can increase profits by hiring more workers. However, if the cost of hiring an additional worker, so the wages paid to those workers, are greater than the value than they add to the firm will hire fewer workers. Now, profit maximization occurs where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage rate. Both of these decisions, the firm's output level and how many workers to hire, follow the same profit maximizing logic. In the production decision, the firm compares the marginal revenue to the marginal cost. In the hiring decision, the firm compares the value of what a worker produces to the wage they're paid. In both cases, the firm stops increasing production or hiring workers, which in effect is the same thing in this case, when the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So let's go back to that bakery example. In the production decision, the bakery decides how many cookies to bake by comparing the revenue from selling one more cookie to the marginal cost of baking it. They're going to bake cookies up to the point where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that will maximize their profits. Now, when it comes to hiring workers, the bakery also faces a decision. How many bakers should they hire? Each baker contributes to producing more cookies, and the value of their contribution depends on how many additional cookies they can produce and what those cookies sell for. The bakery will keep hiring workers as long as the value of what they produce is greater than the wage they have to pay. So they'll stop hiring when the marginal value of the employee's production is equal to their wage rate. So let's toss some numbers in here. If the value the cookies a baker produces an hour is $25, but they only need to pay that baker $20 an hour, they will hire more bakers. But if the value of those cookies drop to $20 or even lower, the firm will stop hiring because it's no longer profitable to do so at that wage. Now, something that's common in economics is people saying, sure, this theory is great, but people don't really take this stuff into account. Or sometimes they don't even know the things that your model says they need to know when they make their decisions. Now, this may be true in some cases, but what's interesting is that people behave as if they do take these things into account. For economists, this is great because we don't need to know if it's exactly what's going on in people's heads, as long as our theory maps onto their actions and shows how different changes will result in different responses. Even though firms might not sit down and explicitly calculate the marginal productivity of each worker, and even if it's not possible to do so because of the complex production patterns, their actions will still align with the principles of marginal productivity theory. The key idea here is that firms are always trying to be as efficient as possible and trying to maximize profits to stay in business. So let's go back to that small pizza shop I talked about earlier. The owner might not calculate exactly how much value each delivery boy and counter staff worker adds to the shop's revenue, but they know that if the shop is getting busy and customers are waiting too long, hiring another worker might speed things up and bring in more customers or satisfy their customers more and have them willing to pay higher prices. On the other hand, if the shop is slow and not selling enough pizza, hiring more staff would just increase their costs without increasing their revenue. The owner makes decisions based on these practical, real-life observations, but these real-life practical observations are in line with the principle of marginal productivity theory. Our theory that we've been talking about maps onto what types of decisions and how the owner of firms or the managers of firms reach these decisions. Employers constantly make decisions that reflect how valuable each worker is to the firm, even if they're not explicitly, writing down equations to figure this out. For example, if hiring an additional worker helps the company produce more goods and earn more revenue than the cost of that worker's wages, the employer will hire them. If they don't produce more goods and earn more revenue than their wage, if their wage is higher than that, then they won't hire. This is the basic logic of marginal productivity theory. And employers and employees act as if they understand marginal productivity because failing to do so can hurt their profitability. Now, I've been going on pretty long, and we're a little bit less than halfway through the chapter still. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll begin with the next section in the next lecture.